Hello and welcome to the Vaults of Terra. My name is Ed, and today we'll be starting our first of many videos concerning one of the most iconic armies in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the Space Marines. Now, this video is only intended to be an introduction to the Space Marines, although we will cover a vast number of topics concerning these iconic superhumans. However, we will also have more videos coming up soon, which will detail more about the Space Marines' physiology, their technology, and about their army organisation. Firstly, I just want to give you an overview of the background for the Space Marines, just so those of you who aren't aware of it can get a little bit of insight. Now, the Space Marines are also called the Adepts Astartes, which is their official name, and are also called the Angels of Death by those who are more superstitious and believe very fervently in the Emperor. And they are one of the most elite and feared fighting forces in the entire Imperium. They are primarily organised into chapters, which are self-contained armies equipped with their own transports, non-combative personnel, etc. And there are roughly about 1,000 chapters in the Imperium currently today. Because the Space Marines are made up of such small numbers, only 1,000 Marines per chapter, they are usually too few Space Marines to actually form a full, cohesive military force that could take over a planet. However, they usually operate as highly mobile strike forces, taking on the most dangerous missions, such as lightning raids behind enemy lines, infiltration tasks, and things such as tunnel fighting or ship-to-ship fighting in space combat. Through training and conditioning, Space Marines are physically and mentally superior to any other fighting force in the Imperium, bar none, and are used throughout the galaxy to help quell the Emperor's enemies and bring justice to those humans who live on the edge of Imperial space. Now, a little bit of history for the Space Marines. They were first created out of genetic material taken from the Primarchs, superhuman beings that I have mentioned before, who were the genetic sons of the Emperor himself. Now, there were originally 20 Space Marine legions created, each from the genetic material of an individual Primarch. And these legions took part in the Great Crusade, the great endeavour which the Emperor undertook to reclaim the galaxy after the Dark Age of technology and the Age of Strife. At the end of the Crusade, Space Marines were brought to the fore of the fighting, when the Emperor's most favoured son, Horus, took up arms against his father and led a fully half the Space Marine legions, that's 9, against the Emperor himself. Now, this rebellion would become known as the Horus Heresy, and culminated in the Siege of Terra, which was one of the most dramatic and chaotic battles of the entire heresy itself. In the end, Horus was slain by the Emperor, but not before the Emperor was gravely injured, and the Blood Angel's Primarch Sanguinius was killed at the hands of Horus. After the Horus Heresy, when the Emperor was put onto the Golden Throne, the Space Marines were left in a strange position. Their dark brothers who had turned to evil were driven back into the Eye of Terror, but they were left still a very powerful force in the Imperium, and the new leaders of the Imperium, the High Lords of Terror, were very worried that such power, now that there was no Emperor to guide it, could be used for great evil in the galaxy. Thus, one of the Primarchs, known as Robert Gulliman of the Ultramarines, penned a seminal work known as the Codex Starties. The Codex Starties was a book that laid out the rules and provisions that should govern each Adeptus Astartes chapter, and so organised these massive legions into small mobile armies known as chapters, which I've mentioned before. These chapters remain today and are autonomous to many other military commands, following the same traditions and values that their Primarchs laid down for them 10,000 years before. Now we've mentioned some of the history of the Space Marines, let us move on to their organisation. The Adeptus Astartes, as I have mentioned before, are an autonomous force. Each does not have to take any orders other than those from the High Lords of Terror and some sector commanders themselves. They can choose when and where to make war, and as such can actually be quite a useful fighting force or quite an ineffective fighting force depending on the combat situation. They have their own transport, warp-capable spacecraft, etc., and also have a huge legion of personnel who aren't actually Space Marines themselves, but look after the Space Marines' war gear, maintain their machinery, in fact look after the health of the Space Marines themselves, and even do things like sweep floors. There's an incredible number of people who actually work to keep these 1,000 Space Marine chapters going. as I've mentioned, there are roughly 1,000 chapters, the most famous of which many of you will know being the Ultramarines, Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Space Wolves, White Scars, Salamanders, Imperial Fists. I could go on. Now, of course, the ones I did mention there were first founding chapters, but there are many more other founding chapters who took place over the 10,000 years since the Emperor was interred on the Golden Throne. And they are also quite famous as well. Many, such as the Crimson Fists or the Black Templars, are even used in the main game as a primary force with their own special organisation and special rules. Moving back into the universe, of course, the Space Marines themselves are only 1,000 strong in their chapter. Now, this is broken down into 10 different companies within each chapter, making 100 Space Marines in each, which is further broken down into squads of 10 Battle Brothers. Now, many of these squads are actually specialist squads who deal with different threats in different ways, but I shall move on to talk about them later on in this video. What I want to talk about now is actually the Space Marines' homeworlds themselves. Now, usually Space Marines are found within a fortress monastery. These are gigantic structures built usually on or near a chapter's recruiting worlds or on their homeworld itself. These great bastions of the Space Marines are designed to house the Space Marines between battles, allowing them to train in war and also to study the ways of war, becoming not just brute warriors, but also those who think and can adapt very quickly to changing battle situations. Now, I did mention that fortress monasteries were located on planets. Of course, this is not always the case. Some chapters actually locate their fortress monasteries in orbit above a planet, either to keep them safe or to improve conditions for the Space Marines, allowing them to train in more harsh environments, considering if the planets they recruit from are not as harsh as they could be. And also, the Space Marines need not be located in a fortress monastery. There are a few who actually travel the stars in gigantic fleets. An example of which being the Black Templars, who go on great crusades of their own, trying to reclaim vast swathes of the galaxy that have fallen away from the Imperium. Now, I will talk more about each individual chapter's recruitment style and fortress monastery in their own videos, but for now, I just wanted to give you an overview of how they existed outside the battles in which many of us will have seen them in. Moving on to something a little bit more technical, now I'll talk about the tactical organisation of Space Marine legions. Now, most Space Marine legions follow this organisation, although not every single one does, a notable exception being the Space Wolves, who have their own methods of constructing companies and their own style squads, which will be mentioned in their own video. However, a good overview for anyone who doesn't really know about the Space Marines is that they can be divided into 3 main types of unit. Most Space Marines will be what are known as tactical Marines. These are essentially generic Space Marines, if one could ever give them that term, armoured in power armour and equipped with either a bolt gun or another more specialised piece of equipment used in that situation. Tactical Marines have a broad range of applications and can be used in many situations, as they are highly adaptable and are trained to do so. However, there are 2 other types, which can also be used in specialist situations. Next most common is usually the Assault Marine. Assault Marines are actually similarly armoured and armed to Tactical Marines, but they also are equipped with something known as a jump pack. Now, this is quite a large piece of equipment attached to the back of the Space Marines' power armour and allows them to literally leap over obstacles, enemies, into combat very quickly. And it also means that they can't always be used in long-range fire support, considering that if you're rushing towards the enemy, you tend to want to hit them with something when you get there, and thus they are usually armed with things such as bolt pistols and chainswords, which I will mention later. Lastly, in the main force organisation, there are things called Devastator Marines. Now, Devastator Marines usually are armed with the chapter's most heavy weapons, either plasma cannons, las cannons, heavy bolters, and missile launchers, to be naming some of the few pieces of equipment they carry around with them. And these gigantic pieces of kit could never be wielded by a human being, they're too large, but they provide the Space Marine with an incredible amount of firepower to lay down into the battlefield, sacrificing, of course, some of their mobility. Now, those 3 are obviously the main forces in a chapter, but they are not the only forces. There are other smaller divisions within a chapter that actually give them their versatility. The first of these smaller types is actually the Scouts. Now, Space Marine Scouts are not actually full battle brothers, as the Space Marines are known, but they're in fact neophytes, usually new Space Marines who have just been recruited into a chapter and are still receiving their genetic upgrades, which will allow them to become full-blown battle brothers. These scouts are being trained in the ways of war, usually by a Space Marine sergeant who has been assigned to this scout squad, usually made up of about 10 men, and they are armoured in quite light armour and equipped usually with the chapter's long-range weaponry, increasing of course their survivability and allowing them to have a great deal of use in infiltration tasks behind enemy lines. Now the final group that I want to talk about are actually the Terminators. Now many of you will have known the term Terminators from the time you watched a film with a large muscly man who turned into a shiny skeleton, but Terminators in the Warhammer 40,000 universe have a slightly different getup. They are usually normal Space Marines who are veterans who have served with a company for a great deal of years, or have been in a chapter for a very long time. So long, in fact, that they have earned the honour of wearing Terminator Armor, huge hulking pieces of kit which dwarf a normal Space Marine and make them into veritable walking tanks. They are equipped with heavy weaponry and are able to deal with many very tough threats with their close combat weaponry as well, usually a Power Fist, or even a Thunderhammer if the situation requires it. Now that I've talked a bit about the Space Marines and their organisation, I want to move on to just a minor point, which is actually the chapter cult. Now this is a very lore-heavy aspect of the Space Marines, but it is essentially how each Space Marine chapter venerates the God Emperor. Now, many chapter cults are actually controlled by a chaplain or a group of chaplains who are usually tasked with administering the spiritual matters of every chapter. Now, of course, this organisation can change depending on the chapter, and I will be telling you about each individual chapter's chaplains in their own video. However, I will let you know that there are some chaplains who go beyond their usual spiritual ministrations and have to tend to other matters, usually of a darker nature. Now, chaplains are not the only specialist marine within their individual chapters. There are several others, such as tech marines, who have the task of looking after the chapter's war gear and weaponry, the psychic librarians, who are actually powerful psychic soldiers who have been moulded by their individual chapters into incredible weapons, and even the apothecaries, who are vital to continuing the chapter's line and lineage by harvesting the gene seed and other specialist organs from dead Space Marines who have fallen in battle. Moving on from the specialist Marines and the chapter's individual cults, I will now talk a little bit about their equipment. Now, I have mentioned their equipment before, and many of you will be familiar with much of what I'm about to say, but this is mainly for those who have never really seen or heard about a Space Marine before. Space Marine's most usual weaponry, which is a primary source of equipment in this universe, is actually a bolt gun. Now, some of you may be aware of bolt guns in the real world. They are actually devices used in the slaughterhouse process in order to deal with cattle very quickly. Not so in the Warhammer 40,000 universe by any stretch. Bolt guns in this universe are actually large weapons which are similar in look to a machine gun or submachine gun, and fire at a similar rate, but actually have an ammunition which is a mass-reactive self-propelled shell. Thus, what they really are most like are RPGs. So imagine each individual Marine is armed with a weapon that is similar in rate of fire to a machine gun, but fires rockets. Yeah, that's pretty impressive. That is not the only weapon of the Space Marines, although it is the most iconic. They also have the bolt pistol, which is a smaller variant, and other weapons such as flamers, which many of you will know of from the real world, and missile launchers, which can load a variety of different ammunition types, such as the crack missile designed for heavy armour, and the frag missile designed to deal with large units of very lightly armoured enemies. Some of the more specialist weapons are things such as plasma guns, devices that use technology from the dark age of technology in order to operate, and las cannons, usually given only to the Devastator Marines, and designed to deal a huge amount of damage when dealing with things such as heavy armour. Moving on from ranged weaponry, I now want to talk a little bit about the Space Marines' close combat weaponry. Now, the most iconic piece of close combat weaponry is usually used by Assault Marines, and used in conjunction with the bolt pistol, which I mentioned earlier, and that is the chainsword. Now, a lot of you will be familiar with the chainsword if you're an aficionado of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, but for those who don't know, a chainsword is essentially like a chainsaw, but it is several feet longer, has a sword handle, and has an activation stud which, when turned on, will usually be used to cut the enemy into tiny little giblets. It is an incredibly powerful weapon. Of course, it is designed for use against lightly armoured enemies, and can be supplemented with other weapons such as power weapons and force weapons if you are in fact a psyker, such as a librarian. There are other Space Marine close combat weapons which are very iconic, such as the Thunder Hammer, used by Terminators primarily, but also the most useful weapon, especially to any who play the tabletop game, is the Power Fist. It is, as it says on the tin, a giant fist, again usually wielded by Terminators, and designed to essentially allow them to punch with the force of a small cannon, being able to deal huge amounts of damage to armoured weaponry and reducing most soldiers to sludge. So it is in fact a very impressive range of weapons, but I will want to go into more detail about this in the tech section of the Space Marines videos. Moving on from weaponry to armour, the most iconic piece of armour that you will see on a Space Marine is of course power armour. You will be familiar with power armour even if you've only just glanced at some material on the Space Marines. I'm sure pictures of it are now coming up in front of your eyes. Power armour is in fact designed specifically with Space Marines in mind. It is a set of hardened armour plates concealing very powerful electrical muscles beneath its surface, designed to augment the Space Marines' already formidable strength and speed, turning them literally into living weapons, able to move incredibly quickly and take a huge amount of damage when they are in close combat or at range. Now, the most iconic piece of power armour is of course the helmet with the snarling face grill, which gives an air of terror to these noble soldiers and enables them to conduct their business with a great deal of fear, shock and awe. Also, for Space Marine power armour, you will notice they usually have quite wide and armoured shoulders in order to protect them when firing from the hip, and they also have a large backpack or power plant attached to the back of their armour. Again, I will go into more detail about that when we move on to it. Other types of armour to be mentioned is Carapace Armor, usually worn by the Scouts, very small and light, able to be worn by those who are not quite Space Marines yet, and Terminator Armor, again something I've mentioned, which turns any Space Marine into a walking tank, although it does have the hunched shoulders approach, which does give them a slightly strange gait if you imagine them in real life. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the heavy armour of the Space Marines. Not, of course, the physical armour that they wear, but the vehicles that they own. The most common Space Marine vehicle is the Rhino APC tank, designed to bring Space Marines quickly into battle, usually housing about 10 men. And it also has a supplement known as the Razorback, which can have a weapons turret attached to the top in order to give a greater survivability to the Marines inside. They also have tanks known as the Predator tank, with its many variants designed to take on the usual tanks that can be seen in other armies. They have the Vindicator long-range tank, which is designed to hurl large shells at the enemy's battle lines, and also the Land Raider, an incredible piece of kit, being the most powerful tank in the Space Marines army, and actually reminiscent of some of the World War I tanks, if you have any idea of those design. They are massive vehicles, and one of the most iconic on any battlefield, either model or in the universe itself. They actually also have some other vehicles as well known, such as land speeders, which are one of the few examples of anti-grav technology in the Imperium, used to speed around the edge of battles and fire a plethora of weaponry into the enemy's flanks. They also have the standard attack bikes, and just bikes which Space Marines or even Scouts will use to quickly get into combat from behind enemy lines. And they also have a few quite large aerial vehicles, such as the Thunderhawk gunship, another iconic symbol of the Space Marines, and also smaller vehicles such as the Storm Raven and Storm Talon gunships. Now that I've talked a bit about the weaponry and the vehicles of the Space Marines, I'm going to move on to a little bit more lore-heavy subjects such as recruitment and training of the Space Marines. Now, the recruits for Space Marines are chosen from some of the best in humanity. They need to be. in order to survive the trials and tribulations that they will go through in order to become Space Marines. They usually are taken from feral worlds or hive worlds, worlds that don't have a very highly advanced culture or technology, thus enabling the children to be very fierce from a young age, as they are required to be children in order to be recruited, so that their natural growth can be augmented by the specialist growth that can be planned by the Space Marine apothecaries. Once a recruit is chosen through one of the many different varieties of choosing right that a Space Marine chapter can use, they will be taken to their chapter's fortress monastery and implanted with the many different genetically enhanced organs that make up a Space Marine, ranging from the gene seed to the black carapace. All of these I will actually explain in a Space Marine physiology video that I will be doing later on. Needless to say though, these implants allow a young boy to become a very powerfully armed and armoured Space Marine. They will be physically and mentally augmented, but of course this augmentation does not come without risk. Many do die from these augments because of course they are genetically unstable, and it has been 10,000 years since this process was implemented, and so subtle variances and errors have started to creep into the process, allowing for many to exhibit very strange physical behaviours when on or off the battlefield. Once the Space Marine aspirant has been implanted with his new organs, he will be taken and trained for up to a decade, if not longer, in order to become a fully blown Space Marine. This will usually start in the Fortress Monastery or aboard the fleet of the Space Marine chapter, but will later lead to him being part of the Space Marine scout companies, going in and around the battles that the Space Marines take part in order to achieve a battle knowledge that cannot be reached usually in a classroom or in a battle drill. After a great deal of time, the Space Marine aspirants will eventually become neophytes and then finally become Space Marines. This process taking far longer than the recruitment of the Imperial Guard, which is usually find a young man, give him a lasgun and throw him at the enemy. This does mean though that Space Marines become the premier fighting force in the galaxy, and very few can stand against them through this very Spartan training regime. Now that's about all I wanted to say about the Space Marines in this aspect. They are a very lore-heavy army and require a great deal of explanation, and thus I will be doing a number of videos explaining each individual chapter, the armour, the weaponry, everything from the ground up. But before I go, I just want to share with you a little thing that I found when doing my research, and that's a daily routine for the Space Marines. Now this was featured in one of the early codexes for the Space Marines. I think it was 3rd or 4th edition, and it's quite interesting because it gives you an insight into how a Space Marine operates and how they think. So a Space Marine's day will usually start about 0400 hours, 4 o'clock in the morning for anyone who's real. And this is known as the Timeful morning prayer, when the company chaplain or one of their officers will lead the chapter in a prayer to the Emperor and reiterate their devotion. This lasts for about an hour, so if you can imagine praying for an hour, well done you, and will lead to the 0500 morning firing rites. This is when a Space Marine will have to engage in target practice using personal and squad-based weaponry, and awards and punishments may be handed out for good or bad accuracy. At 0700, 7 o'clock in the morning, morning battle practice begins. This is generally close quarters oriented, however there may be live fire scenarios in hazardous environments planned in order to extend a Space Marine's operational knowledge. By 1200 hours, round about midday, the midday prayer is announced, in addition to any injuries or problems being noted down by a tech marine or an apothecary and dealt with in this time. At 1300 hours, the first meal of the day will be eaten, known as the midday meal to many real human beings, you and me obviously. It's when local wildlife killed during the morning's firing activities will be brought and prepared and then eaten by the Space Marines who killed them, allowing them a practice in survival skills as well as anything else. At 13:15 hours, a fully 15 minutes after they started their lunch, they start their tactical indoctrination. This can take many forms and can range from hypnagogic suggestion tapes to a sit-down briefing in a room, and can concern anything from new alien species to technology or strategy. It will also be common for the morning's battle drills to be debriefed in this time as well, to draw attention to any problems. At 1500 hours, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, battle practice will start again. This focuses more on the Space Marines' ability to work in a team and combine tactics in conjunction with vehicles, dreadnoughts, who I will mention later, and other Devastator squads, who will usually be training with long-range weaponry during this time. At about 2000 hours, which is 8 o'clock in the evening for everyone else, it's another evening prayer, when more prayer is added, and gene seed testing may occur, if the apothecary feels that gene seed needs testing at this point, and will allow the chapter a brief respite from their duties. At 2100 hours, 9 o'clock, the evening meal will begin, which is usually a feast by human standards, provided by the chapter serfs or servants, and may even be filled with alcohol if a chapter master allows such a thing to occur. I know the Space Wolves will be happy at this point. After that, at about 21:30, so that's another half an hour for food, the night firing exercises will begin. Of course, if you are based in a chapter that is in orbit, you can't really have night fire exercises. So you will usually either have harsh weather fighting testing or some other form of hard combat, such as underwater fighting, if you can imagine that. At 23:15, which is 11:15 PM for all us normal people, the Space Marines will begin their maintenance rituals, i.e. going through all their arms and armour that they use during the day, and making sure that it is up to the usual standards of the Tech Marine, of course, who will be going around checking everybody's armour. At 23:45, Space Marines will be given free time, which is allowing them time to reflect upon their duties and perform any small tasks which they are needing to do, but of course it's not a certainty and free time may not be given to some Space Marines. And at midnight, only 15 minutes after their free time begins, rest period begins, when they get a 4-hour sleep before the whole cycle begins again. Now this is not a strict agenda, but it is a common agenda, and lets you know exactly how much time is spent in a Space Marine's life aiming towards combat. Well, thank you for listening to our video today. It's been a long one, and it's also a very well-deserved one, seeing as you've all had to wait for me to get back to the internet. I'm glad you've had a chance to listen, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any more suggestions or comments for videos, do let me know in the comments below, and I will get on it as soon as possible. Well, be prepared, because our next video will be coming up shortly, and that will be dealing with the technology of the Space Marines, i.e. their arms, their armour, and their vehicles and weaponry.
See you next time on Vaults of Terra!